Three, two, one, and we are rocking and rolling. Dr. Zareer Masani, historian, author, and broadcaster, is joining me today. Zareer, welcome to my channel. It's an absolute pleasure to be talking to you.
Very nice to be talking to you, Sam.
So, a brief introduction for those of you who don't know. Dr. Zareer Masani has an Oxford History Doctorate and is the author of 4 books on the topic of Indian history. Zareer spent 20 years working as a current affairs producer for the BBC and currently works as, am I correct in saying, a freelance historian, journalist, and broadcaster? Is that correct?
Well, yes, not all at the same time, but that more or less covers it.
Was that an adequate introduction? Is there anything you would add or take away from that summary?
No, that's fine.
So, there's a few things I'd like to speak to you about today. One of them is Winston Churchill, the legacy of Winston Churchill, and how British people should view Sir Winston Churchill. He's regarded by many as one of the greatest leaders in world history and is regularly named as the greatest Briton of all time for his determination, perseverance, and patriotic devotion towards the nation in the fight against Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. But an increasingly vocal section of our society sees Churchill very differently. They see him as a racist, a white supremacist, and a man who was responsible for the deaths of millions of people during the Bengal Famine through his wartime policies and potentially his personal neglect. What do you think about these claims being levied towards Churchill? Is it historical revisionism? Is there truth to it?
Well, there was plenty of criticism of Churchill in his own lifetime. And I think what we're hearing now is hugely exaggerated, exaggerating his faults, which undoubtedly, some of which he undoubtedly had. Taking the list of things you quoted, racism, yes. He was born in Victorian England when most people were racist. Most Indians were racist, and still are about color, etc. So racism was not Churchill's monopoly. It was pretty widespread. But he didn't actively discriminate against anyone. He certainly didn't kill millions of people. And I think coming to the point about white supremacy, he certainly believed that the English race, as he put it, were superior to all their neighbors and the rest of the world. And that was a very firm belief. Now, that wasn't white supremacy, it was just nationalism. And he was really quite friendly to several Indian and African people whom he met in the course of his long career. What I would say is, in terms of the Bengal famine, that has been especially laid at his door because it happened in 1943 during the Second World War when he was leading the war cabinet back in London. So he was about 6,000 miles away from Bengal at the time. He had very little personal input. He didn't micromanage affairs at all. He was very laissez-faire in that respect. He led, from the front, but he didn't look at managing people's sort of minutiae. So in terms of the way the Bengal famine was handled, firstly, everyone agrees that it was a climatic cyclical famine caused by a monsoon failure. It was exacerbated by the fact that there was a world war going on and the Japanese were invading India at the time, had already occupied Burma. So Bengal was not getting food supplies from Burma. Very difficult to have alleviated the famine quickly in that situation. And yes, there was neglect, but the neglect was pretty local. And it's worth remembering that there was a democratically elected provincial government which was running Bengal at the time, led by the Muslim League. And they bungled things and mismanaged the famine. They were at loggerheads also with the trading communities who were mostly Hindu and were often speculating and hoarding food grains, which happens in wartime. So by the time the war cabinet got to know about it, it was already pretty bad. in the course of that year, 43 to 44, Churchill and the War Cabinet sent 1 million tons of food grains to Bengal from other parts of India and from Australia and from Canada. Churchill did not divert some food shipments which were coming from Australia to Europe, where there were major food shortages, because it would have made a major detour across waters which were full of Japanese submarines. So very unlikely those shipments would have made it to Calcutta. And so they were bound for elsewhere. But Bengal got 1 million tons of food grains, which is why the famine was over in a year.
If you were to sort of, let's say that I was a cynic and I was convinced that Churchill was responsible, would you, if you were to give a list of the causes, I mean, you just summarized them quite nicely. What do you think the main cause of the famine was, or do you think it really was such a mosaic of various different factors?
It was a convergence of factors, the most important of which was the fact that there was a world war with the Japanese invading India via Burma, which they'd already occupied. So Calcutta and Bengal were not getting the shipments that they used to from Burma. So a huge cut in supplies. Plus, as people do in wartime, merchants tend to trade. There tends to be profiteering. So there was some of that. There was no, India's greatest expert on famine, Amartya Sen, who won the Nobel Prize, has examined this in great detail. And he said there wasn't actually a shortage of food grains in Bengal. There was a shortage of purchasing power because the prices had gone up. And the prices had gone up partly by wartime speculation and partly by mismanagement by the provincial authorities. So laying this at Churchill's door, he was busy fighting in 43, but the war had by no means been won against Germany. So he was fighting back to the wall, a battle of survival in Britain and Europe. And he really did not and was not able to apply the full attention that might have been given in peacetime.
What would you say to the argument that 2.5 million Indians fought or at least took part in the war effort in World War II, and that if such an event, such as a famine or a food shortage, had taken place in England, well, it wouldn't have taken place in England because Churchill simply wouldn't have let that happen. In fact, he was very generous with his rationing for the public in World War II, as I understand it. Do you think there's an argument that he should have done more sooner? The 1 million tons of grain you mentioned that ended the famine after a year, do you think that the argument is that it was too little, too late, and that he didn't know enough? And that's not to say that makes him responsible either. That's not to say that due to the fact it was too little, too late, Winston Churchill's a terrible, terrible man. But do you think there's an argument that he didn't do enough quick enough?
Well, there can always be an argument in hindsight that more should have been done for anything. I'm not at all sure that famine rationing was generous in Britain at the time.
No.
Certainly all the accounts I read is people managing on very short rations with all sorts of improvisations. Okay. Certainly there were areas of Greece and Italy which were in danger of major famine, where shipments of grain had to be sent after the Germans were pushed back. So that was part of it. I think there's no doubt that had the authorities in Bengal, which meant largely the elected authorities, acted sooner and actually alerted the Viceroy's government sooner, there would have been less casualties. Coming to the point about how many people fought for Britain, yes, 2.5 million people fought for Britain, but they fought in a professional volunteer army. There was no conscription. It was a huge form of employment and enrichment for the areas they came from. And people queued up for, miles to actually be recruited. So not because they were doing it out of the goodness of their hearts, but because their families had served in armies for generations. That was their job. And Churchill was very fulsome in his praise of the Indian Army. There are several quotations where he said how wonderful they were. And India was very well paid for its armed forces. It had foreign balances of 50 billion pounds at the end of World War II for payment of its army, because the British government paid the government of India, both before and after independence, for the use of Indian troops.
Yeah, that's very interesting, especially the point that you raised about the willingness of the Indians to sign up to join the army, because you often hear by people that are intent on deriding Churchill and blaming him for the famine, you often hear them making the point I just made, saying 2.5 million Indians fought for Britain, and as such Churchill should have done more. But you seem to be kind of turning that on its head and saying, would you say in some ways that Britain was doing them a favour by allowing them to sign up and paying them for it also?
Well, no one was doing either party favors. They were a professional army. People sign up to be in a paid army. You call them volunteers, mercenaries, professionals. No one is doing a favor either way. But as far as their courage and their performance was concerned, Churchill was very fulsome in his praise of them.
I was going to ask you about that because there's this famous quote of Churchill's, which I believe may have been taken out of context, and perhaps you can provide the correct context, where he said that Indians are a beastly people with a beastly religion. And I've seen that quote attributed to him all over the place by people that are keen to represent or misrepresent Sir Winston Churchill in a certain way. Could you tell me a little bit about the context of that quote and what you think about it?
Well, the context of the quote was that Churchill often made exclamations and swore at people when he was cross about something, and he often then apologized afterwards and didn't mean it. As far as this remark about Indians being a beastly people with a beastly religion, yes, he did say something like that, but it was an exclamation he made when he heard that the Congress, led by Gandhi, had launched the Quit India movement in 1942 at the height of the war, when the Japanese were, seriously invading India. And he saw this as a stab in the back, which, in any other situation it would have been, for a movement to launch a sort of eviction campaign against you at the moment when they're being invaded. So I think when his reaction was, Indians are a beastly people with a beastly religion, he didn't mean it about all Indians. He certainly didn't mean it about Muslims, who had a completely different religion. The majority of the Indian army were Muslim. So he clearly meant this, directed at Gandhi and the Congress, whom he regarded as Hindu Brahmin dominated, and against the interests both of Muslims and of untouchables. So he was a great champion of Indian untouchables and felt that they deserved a much better deal than Gandhi and the Congress were offering them.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's been very interesting for me looking into this because, as you're aware, about a year or 18 months ago, there was the Black Lives Matter movement began as a result of George Floyd being killed on the other side of the Atlantic. And it seems as if here in England or Britain, we sort of imported some of the US's politics and we sort of made it our own. And the racial conversation in this country is very different to the racial conversation in America, and yet some people seem to be desperate to make similarities as if to say not only are they similar, but they're almost identical. And it was around this time that I heard the accusation towards Churchill that he was responsible for the Bengal famine. So I began looking into it about 2 weeks ago. And I read this book, which I believe you're aware of, Churchill's Secret War. What are your thoughts on the book, which essentially, for anyone listening, is pretty anti-empire and anti-Churchill and really does lay a lot of blame at his feet for the famine?
The first thing that needs to be said is that the book is a diatribe against Churchill by a Bengali American journalist, second generation, born in America, who knows very little about India and is not a historian. And she has collected every unsavory fact about Churchill which she could, distorted the figures and the statistics about the famine itself. There is a public correspondence between her and Amartya Sen in the New York Times, if you Google it, where he points out that she has completely misread the statistics in order, as he has put it, to nail Churchill, in her eagerness to nail Churchill. And Amartya Sen, who is a very balanced famine economist, has said it has nothing to do with Churchill. The famine was to do with the structure of agriculture and the market for food grains, which she has distorted. So I really would, I have skimmed the book some years ago. It's been around for a while. And I think, as the title suggests, it's a conspiracist account, hugely biased.
Do you think that this book in particular has done a lot of damage to the reputation of Churchill, or have you heard the criticisms towards his culpability for the Bengal famine? Have these been doing the rounds in academic circles for a while, or?
I don't think it has much to do with the book. No historian I know takes the book seriously.
Okay.
It is taken seriously by activists like someone called Kahinda Andrews at Birmingham.
Yeah, I know
And
him,
people
yeah.
like that. And if they didn't find Madhushree Mukherjee's book, they would find other rags or articles they had written, nailing Churchill. So I think it's part of a kind of anti-Churchill literature which has been around and will continue to be around.
Yeah, well, this kind of brings me on to something I've been thinking about a lot recently. It's really fascinating the extent to which, although you pointed out that the author of the book isn't a historian, but on a more general basis, moving away from Churchill somewhat, it's very interesting the extent to which different historians can view the exact same historical event, figure or period of time and reach such wildly different conclusions. Is this something that you've spent much time ruminating on, and the reasons behind that? Is it political persuasion? Is it personality disposition or general cultural upbringing which leads people to reach such different conclusions?
Well, I have yet to see any serious historian holding Churchill responsible for the Bengal famine. The closest you get to it is Amartya Sen, who is an economist, who blames the British government for neglecting the famine. It's a sin of omission rather than commission, which got worse before they actually acted to end it. So that is the nearest you can get that they should have taken earlier action, which they probably would have done had there not been a world war going on. So I don't think, as far as the Bengal famine is concerned, that there is any serious disagreement among historians.
That's very interesting, and I must say I'm happy to hear you say that, because as I said, I did find the book persuasive, although I did get the impression when I was reading it that a lot of information was being cherry picked and omitted. It felt so biased as to be suspicious.
Well, do Google New York Times Amartya Sen Madhushree Mukherjee, and you'll get the text of their falling out and debate.
Okay, well, that's very interesting.
He really knocks her down.
Right. Well, that's very interesting. I've heard it said that Churchill. Some people think that it's a sign of omission, regrets, or a sign of guilt. The fact that Churchill wrote 6 volumes on World War II and he didn't reference the famine once. What do you think about that?
I haven't read his 6 volumes on World War II, so I can't possibly say what he did or didn't include. It depends how, comprehensive they were. I think he wrote from a rather novelistic point of view, with a rather novelistic style. He picked the things that appealed to him and where he also shone in retrospect. He probably didn't focus on things that were negative. I don't think the Bengal famine would have been the only example.
Sure, that's what I was thinking, and it actually leads me neatly on to my next question. I don't know if you'll be equipped to answer this. I hope you are. In terms of mortality, how does the Bengal famine sort of tot up against other historical events in the last century or so? Of course, there's a few obvious ones that we can all think of, but on a smaller scale, because it's a relatively, I would say, unknown atrocity. Once you're out of the historian of the circle of academia and historians, the Bengal famine isn't something that your average Joe on the street has heard of. Are there many other large-scale atrocities of a similar size that are relatively unknown, or does the Bengal famine stand out?
Well, firstly, it isn't an atrocity. A famine is a structural agrarian phenomenon. So, I mean, no one willed it or caused it. No individual willed it or caused it. So it's not an atrocity like the Holocaust was, like the genocide of the Armenians was in Ottoman Turkey. So there are other, I mean, the Jewish Holocaust took about 6 million lives. The Armenian Holocaust took 1 million or more lives. So, I mean, these were comparable in terms of casualties, but I wouldn't call it an atrocity.
Okay, perhaps I was. I don't fully understand the definition of the term atrocity. Maybe
Well,
I was.
atrocity is something atrocious committed by people.
Sure. Okay.
It's not. It's an act of volition.
So activists and the author of Churchill's Secret War would argue that the Bengal famine was an atrocity, but you're putting forward the argument that most historians don't view it that way.
Yeah.
No. Okay.
I don't think anyone who understands famine would view any famine as an atrocity. I can't think there are many examples in history of any famine being deliberately caused in order to starve people.
And I also suppose Churchill wouldn't have had an agenda to do such a thing.
Well, it wouldn't have occurred to him. He was busy fighting the Nazis. I mean, Bengal was not on his mind.
No, of course. You wrote in an article for The Critic the following words. On the 4th of August 1943, when Churchill's war cabinet first realised the enormity of the famine, actually, you know what? You've actually already mentioned this yourself. It's about the tons of grain that he sent over, and I just wanted to comment on the fact that these really don't sound like the words or the actions of a genocidal maniac intent on killing Bengalis, does it?
No, certainly not. And I think Churchill had better things to do than kill Bengalis. Why would he want to kill Bengalis? He was opposed to independence under the Congress, which he regarded as a Hindu Brahmin-dominated organization, which would oppress minorities, including untouchables. So he was, in that sense, siding with what he saw as the underdog. There was no question of anything genocidal involved. And he had nothing in particular against Bengalis. I mean, Gandhi, whom he often abused and reviled and disliked, he was a Gujarati, not a Bengali.
So I'd like to just circle back to where we were slightly earlier in the conversation. You put forward the argument and, well, the fact, really, that in the Victorian times and shortly after in Churchill's later life, that much more people were racist, and racism wasn't an explicitly white or British tendency or problem. It was something, racist views were held much more widely by people all over the world. To what extent do you think it's an error to sort of retrospectively judge historical figures by the values of today?
I think it's a huge error, and I don't think it does anyone any good. We don't learn any more about the past by getting involved with making these judgments. History is not about making judgments, it's about learning about the past. And if we get diverted into, was this right? Was this wrong? It's not, we stop looking at what actually happened and what people were actually like. So I think, one looks back and says, obviously someone who existed in terms of Victorian values would not be considered an egalitarian, politically correct person today, and we wouldn't. We might even sort of censure them and censor them and even prosecute them. But that makes no sense about something that happened 200 years ago.
I suppose the argument that sort of, I use these terms loosely, sort of left wings, liberals, progressives, the argument that they would put forward is that, I mean, that we do judge historical figures for their actions, and Winston Churchill is considered a national hero, and he's an integral part of many people's identity as British. And the opposing view, the anti-Churchill view, would be that this isn't appropriate in this day and age. And I must say, it's not a view that I share, but I am interested in equipping myself with the most competent argument against such a perspective. Because despite the fact you said we're not supposed to judge historical figures, we do judge historical figures, and they do kind of continue to play a part in the present. So is it still inappropriate to judge Churchill for his racist views and actions?
I think it's inappropriate to judge him for those views and actions in the abstract. If he made a racist comment to someone, if he discriminated against someone, we could certainly sort of, censure him for that. But there is no evidence that Churchill was cruel to anyone. He didn't order people to be tortured, executed. None of those sorts of crimes that dictators are guilty of, which we could certainly judge them for. He wasn't in any way like Stalin or Hitler in the way he treated people. He wasn't at all like people like Saddam Hussein, whom we judge today. So I think judgment needs to be balanced. And if someone has minor faults, of course we notice them and record them, but we don't judge them only for those faults.
Sure. And the argument that's put forward in defense of Churchill's racist utterances or comments, that he was a outspoken, sort of charismatic. He had the tendency to fly off the handle, and crucially, he had the tendency to say things that shocked people. I've heard about his friendship with his friend and politician Leopold Amery, and he used to sometimes make shocking comments in order to sort of get Leopold Amery to be quiet. And the argument is that some of his racist comments were made in this context. Is that something you've heard or that you would put forward?
Yes, Leopold Amery and he were old school friends, and the relationship was, from their school days, one of Churchill ragging Amery, who was a rather pompous, pedantic sort of person, and Churchill often sort of, gently poked fun at him. Apparently once threw him into a swimming pool fully dressed. That sort of, childish pranks, which may have continued into the war cabinet, in the sense that when Churchill had to put up with Amery making very long-winded, circuitous speeches in the war cabinet, Churchill did get quite impatient and either make a joke to cut him off or say something that he knew would irritate him and move the agenda on. Yeah, and Amery didn't like it particularly, and he noted all this in his diary, which was meant to be confidential at the time, and was published later, much later.
Yeah, I think some of the research that I did in preparation for this conversation seemed to indicate that some of his more offensive comments took place in private conversations between himself and Amery, and as you say, they were published much later. And of course, I can hear the progressives, the liberals, the left-wingers, however you would like to summarize them, I can hear them in my ears saying, it's not acceptable to say those things in private, and he's still a terrible thing, and I wouldn't say those things in private. But I would say that probably the flip side of Sir Winston Churchill's tendency to say outrageous things and to be stubborn and argumentative it may be that the positive side of that contributed to why he was such a good leader. Without the totality of his personality, without his whole personality, he may not have had the strength and the determination to lead the country in the way that he did, because great people, and in fact all people, are complicated, are they not?
Yes. Well, he had a dogged determination to fight against Nazism and Hitler much before Chamberlain's government came round to that point of view, and he pushed them in that direction. He was pushing them that way from the early 30s on. And he had a similar dogged opposition to Indian nationalism, which he saw as being Brahmin-dominated by the Congress, which would, discriminate against Muslims, whom he had much more time and respect for. And certainly, if you look at the way he related to Indian politicians, he had very little sympathy for the Congress politicians, who he thought were either sort of upper caste, fops like Nehru, or people like Gandhi, who went around behaving like a half-naked fakir and going up to Buckingham Palace wearing a loincloth to have dinner with George V. All of these things Churchill thought were absurd and offensive. But when he met Muslim politicians like Jinnah, he was very warm and friendly, and he was accused of being partial to them. And Jinnah used to come and have lunch with him at Chartwell, and they got on very well.
That's interesting. In the book Churchill's Secret War, it was said that Churchill's father, Lord Randolph, was Secretary for State for India and held India in very high regard. And when his father died, 20-year-old Winston resolved to pursue his aims and vindicate his memory. So do you think that Churchill had a personal, emotional attachment to India, which contributed to why he was so against the idea of India gaining her independence? Was it a sort of, like a family attachment, that memory of his father? He wanted to continue his father's legacy and not sort of give India away, as it were?
I don't think so. I think Randolph Churchill was only Secretary of State for India quite briefly.
Okay.
He was not a Secretary of State for India who had much influence on British policy towards India. And Winston's main commitment was to empire, to maintaining the British Empire, and India was regarded as the jewel in the empire, and the largest, richest part of the empire. So, not unnaturally, he regarded Indian independence as a sort of death blow to the empire, which it was. And he was determined to put it off as long as possible. What he had in mind, eventually, when he thought Indians were ready for it, was a kind of federation like Canada or Australia, where India would be a federal India under the crown as a dominion, like Canada and Australia. So being a dominion meant being effectively independent of Britain, having your own government, having the king or queen as your head of state, which is the sort of position he would have liked for India probably in another 30 or 40 years.
Well, I'd like to move on from Churchill and the Bengal famine now, but just to tie a ribbon around this part of the conversation, you've been very polite. You've answered all my questions very politely and very patiently. But if you were to be completely honest, would you say that these allegations towards Churchill and the time spent discussing his link to the Bengal famine is wasted time? Do you think it's a waste of our intellect and our thoughts? Are these conversations, quite frankly, do you find them ridiculous, if you were to just give your honest personal opinion?
Well, I do think they're a waste of time, but I don't think they're a waste of historians' time, because I don't know of any serious historians, Indian or British, who are wasting their time on this argument. It is activists like Madhushree Mukherjee, Kahinda Andrews. There is another activist at Cambridge, Priyamvada Gopal, who is a professor of English literature with a fellowship at Churchill College, of all places. So she's actually fully cashing in on the Churchill legacy and benefiting from it. And one of her main missions in life is to sort of throw mud at Churchill.
I'll tell you what I think is also a shame about it is that I don't know what you think about this as a historian, but you know, what do they think they're trying to achieve by destroying something which for many people is almost like it operates as like a founding myth of their patriotism, like it means something for so many people, you know, their idea of Churchill, their pride in beating Hitler in World War II, that patriotism. And for many people, they have grandparents and great grandparents who actually passed away in those wars. I really question the motives of people that are intent on casting shade on people's memories and that period of history. It seems quite sinister, and I don't believe it gets as much criticism in mainstream media or even in society as it should. It seems very unpleasant.
Well, I think their aim is to attack that patriotism. I don't think that upsets them. And yes, I think the whole idea is to kind of undermine what they see as British chauvinism and jingoism, and they, link it with Brexit and with being critical of the EU and this sort of what they would call a little England mentality. So they kind of mix all these things in terms of what they attack. So I think Churchill is attacked as a part of British national pride.
He's attacked. He's considered a personification of what they're trying to tear down.
Yeah.
Do you think Britain should be ashamed of its history? Is the British Empire a national disgrace?
No, of course not. The empire has positive and negative things. I think most of the legacies have been very positive. One can look at the economic legacies, the political legacies, democratic constitutions, parliamentary government across most of the former British Empire. If you look at the Commonwealth, you see that. Compare it with the former French or Spanish empires, half of which are dictatorships. So I think there's been a lot of positive legacy. A few things one might criticize. I think there were elements of racism which, were resented at the time, which I've written about as well. But I don't think that was the dominant aspect of the empire at all.
You mentioned that there's no serious disagreement amongst historians over Churchill's responsibility for the Bengal famine. Would you say there's disagreement amongst historians on the ideas that you just put forward? The idea that you seem to imply there that you think the British Empire was more of a force for good than a force for bad in the world. Am I correct in saying we're onto more hotly contested ground now?
Well, but it was ever thus, I mean, left-wing historians, Marxist historians have a completely different view of the role of the working class, of the emergence of capitalism. So empire isn't the only thing that's contested. A lot of other things are. And I think the empire definitely was a force for modernization in the world. It made the modern world in the 19th century, which emerged out of the empire, certainly modernized India. And if you look at the book I've just been reviewing called The Economic History of India by Tirthankar Roy, who is our foremost economic historian based at the LSE, and he argues that whatever its faults may have been, the East India Company integrated Indian markets, gave stable civil society, and made it possible for modern capitalism to emerge in a way that would never have been possible, and for modern nationhood to emerge in ways that would never have been possible without the British Empire.
The way that I like to put this forward when I'm having this conversation with people, what I often find when people are criticizing the British Empire, just not necessarily historians or academics, just kind of laymen or even activists, when they're criticizing the British Empire, it's like they're unable to perceive it in its correct historical context, i.e. it's one of many empires throughout history. it wasn't particularly unique as an empire, as an institution. It was not unique in its desire to grow, to conquer and rule. There were always empires. You know, there's been dozens of them. So I often find when people talk about the British Empire, it's like they try to isolate it as this one event in history which was different from so many others. But perhaps it's more fitting to compare the ethics of the British Empire to the ethics of other empires rather than to the ethics of today.
Yes, well, I'm part of a project on ethics and empire, which is based at Oxford, and our seminars once a year are very much focused around looking at the ethical aspects of different empires, not just the British one, and comparing them, both the pre-modern and ancient empires, which were very different from the modern ones, the Asian empires versus the European empires, the land empires versus the overseas empires. So there were big differences between different empires. But the common thread was that human politics has aspired to empires for millennia. It has been a sort of natural urge of all powerful nations to try and develop into imperial nations and to either take over territories neighboring them or explore overseas as the British did and take over large parts of America and Asia and Africa. And I think the British Empire is sort of picked on more because it is the most influential modern empire. So people attack the British Empire instead of the Roman Empire. But I don't think, and of course, they don't look at the record of Asian empires like the Mughals or the Chinese Empire or the Aztecs in Mexico with human sacrifices, etc. So one could find a lot of faults with other empires.
Sure. I also found it fascinating. I was listening to you speak on a YouTube video. I believe might have been your interview with Darren Grimes for Reason, to his YouTube channel Reasoned, and I heard you mention that the two things which surprised me, which I'd love you to elaborate on. The first was that the British Empire had very progressive attitudes towards women, and the second was that the British ended slavery in India. These are two, no doubt, of many pieces of facts about the British Empire.
Sorry, I missed the second.
The second was that the British ended slavery in India.
Yeah. Okay.
So these are two very interesting pieces of information. Are there any? Could you elaborate on those two pieces of information? And second of all, are there any other little-known facts about the British Empire in terms of positive effects that it had on the world?
Well, I've already mentioned the economic legacies and the political legacies. You've mentioned women's rights, certainly in India. I can't speak for Africa, but in India, where women had a very restricted, almost slave-like status, the British actually legislated, firstly, to ban the immolation of Hindu widows, which was quite common, called sati. So that was banned. They took action to ban female infanticide, which was very common and unfortunately still is through amniocentesis among Indian Hindus. They allowed the remarriage of Hindu widows, which had been forbidden under Brahminical Hindu law. So they did a lot of things to improve the status of women. And as far as slavery went, yes, slavery in India was abolished by them in 1835. In 1835, the British abolished slavery across the whole empire. In 1841, I think it was, it applied to India. So India got it 5 or 6 years later than the rest of the British Empire. And, it's not as though they were able to totally eradicate it. Slavery is still widely practiced in Africa, which has 9.5 million people in slavery today, according to the Global Slavery Index, because slavery in many ways originated in Africa. It was African kingdoms and African chieftains who enslaved people and then sold them on to Arab traders and then to European traders. And there were slave trades in India, in China, in Ottoman Turkey, much after the British tried to abolish them.
And yet, so many. I live in Bristol, which, as you know, is a very, very left-wing city, and it is obviously the city where the Edward Colston statue was toppled. So there's a real lot of grassroots left-wing activism here, and it does fascinate me the extent to which people seem to be more interested in talking about slavery that ended several hundred years ago than they do slavery which is ongoing today.
Absolutely, and also they will only, and also people only talk about transatlantic slavery involving Africans being transported. What they don't talk about is something much closer to home, which was white slavery. The fact that North African pirates used to regularly raid the southern coasts of England and carry off whole villages full of people to be sold in the North African and Middle Eastern slave trades, where white slaves were highly prized, especially women. So, hundreds of thousands of people were, forcibly trafficked by African and Arab slavers from British coastal villages. Why isn't Bristol talking about that?
Am I correct in saying that the origins of the word slave came from the word Slav, which was a reference to the Eastern European slaves which were captured by the Barbary pirates? Is that correct?
No, the East European slaves were not so much captured by the Barbary pirates as by the Ottoman Turks, who, sold them on. So the Barbary pirates were basically, raiding the coastal areas on the west. Yes, I think the origin, I'm not an etymologist, but I think the origin of slave is Slav.
Which, of course, is a reference to white people, and yet the slave trade, which we hear discussed so much, as you mentioned, is solely the transatlantic slave trade. And another thing that's also missing from these conversations, these deep dives back into history from one specific political perspective, is the fact that there were many black slave traders and merchants on that west coast of Africa that were also hugely profiting from the slave trade. We don't hear much about them when we look back in history, desperate to depict it in a certain way.
Absolutely. And I think West Africa is still pretty much a center of African slavery. I think the last figure I saw on the Global Slavery Index was that there were about 3.5 million people in slavery in Nigeria. And no one in Black Lives Matter seems to be concerned about that.
We almost seem to be intent on fetishizing certain slaves at a certain point in history that's it. It's almost like a sort of a fixation, and it certainly isn't doing our discourse any good today.
Well, I think if you take an example, which I was reading about in the papers the other day, there is someone called David Harwood, who is a Black person, I think from the family of Trinidadian origin, born and settled in England, second or third generation, who has discovered, rightly or wrongly, that he is descended from slaves who were owned by the Harwood family. This is the Earl of Harwood, the Queen's first cousin once removed. And Harwood House up in Leeds is a huge sort of national trust mansion now open to the public, etc. And the Harwoods, owned plantations in the Caribbean, and would have owned slaves, as most people who owned plantations in the Caribbean in the 18th century would have done. But from this, this particular gentleman has made contact with the present Earl of Harwood, and there was a photograph of them together on the front page of some paper, with the Earl of Harwood sort of welcoming him, and they've set up various charities to kind of help Black people and kind of reverse the legacies of slavery. But who's to decide, who deserves to be compensated, who deserves to have these sort of perks being offered 200 years later as, guilt money or blood money? Is it going to the right people? Are they benefiting from it? And these are people who have chosen to come and live in Britain and settle in Britain. So obviously they feel the British state and system has had something to offer them. They're not living in their home country of Jamaica or Guyana or Trinidad. I'm not quite sure how they are suffering from the legacy of slavery. If I go 200 years back, I honestly haven't a clue what my ancestors were doing, how oppressed they were or weren't, and it really doesn't in any way concern me.
So I don't know if you heard about this, but there was a Bristol City Council meeting where all the councillors and the mayor sat around and they voted in favour of reparations, despite the fact that they have no authority to give reparations. There's no clarity on who's receiving the reparations or how it's being distributed. And a local journalist even said to me that the reparations may include money for the white working class as well. To which I thought, well, are these slavery reparations or are we just giving money out to people? It really shocked me. And I actually think that whole meeting is online. And in that meeting, a councillor gave a sort of impassioned speech about why she believed in reparations. And in doing so, she put on an Alabaman accent and pretended to channel the spirit of Rosa Parks.
You've lost me there, I'm afraid. I wouldn't have a clue how people like this expect to carry out a program of reparations. I mean, reparations only make sense in a context like the immediately post-Nazi situation in Europe, where Jews had been, 6 million Jews had been exterminated, their art collections, wealth, etc., had been expropriated. So they were entitled to either get it back and also to get reparations for relatives who had, been killed in the concentration camps. How this can apply to something that happened 200 years ago, when people are actually settled in England, and is the British taxpayer going to pay for it? Is the Bristol taxpayer going to pay for it? In which case, are Black and Asian taxpayers also going to pay for it? Presumably, yes, because the taxation would apply to everyone. So I think it makes no sense to say that the population today, including Black and Asian people, some of them descended from slaves, have to pay reparations to other people descended from slaves.
Yeah, it's
and proving it would be a nightmare, because in this particular case, Harwood was able to link it because of the continuation of the family name, because slaves often took the family name of their owners after they were emancipated, because they didn't have surnames before that. So if you happen to have the same surname, maybe there's a connection, maybe it's just coincidental, but impossible to prove.
Do you think that the UK, I think I know the answer to your question, but do you think the UK is a racist country?
No, because, to apply this adjective to the UK, one is suggesting that there is something overwhelmingly racist about the UK or all of the UK, which is a complete nonsense. Of course, there are some people in the UK, I can't begin to count them now, who are racist and presumably will always be racist. And as I say, it doesn't apply just to white people. Many of the Indians and Asians I know are pretty racist towards Caribbean, Black African people. I'm told within Black African ethnicities, there is a kind of hierarchy according to how Black people are or how light-skinned they are. apparently. They prefer light skins in Africa. So this kind of racism exists everywhere. I think Britain has the toughest anti-racist legislation anywhere in the world. There is no other country in the world which offers the same protection as the Race Relations Acts in Britain do. I was part of campaigning for them in the 1970s and for strengthening them. And I think it's made it very easy for anyone who suffers any kind of discrimination to go and sue.
Do you think there's an argument that the UK is actually one of the least racist places in the world?
Yeah, no. As I said, it has the toughest anti-racist legislation. It is, in my opinion, certainly one of the most tolerant countries in the world, which is why so many people of Black and Asian and other foreign descent choose to come and live here and feel more welcome here than they would in most other European countries. I can't think of any other European country. Possibly Germany, seems to attract quite a lot of Turkish and Iraqi migrants because the job market there is better than in Britain, and the welfare state there is pretty good.
What about yourself in your life and career living in this country? Has racism been a problem that you've encountered?
No, but then people will say, oh, it's to do with class. I mean, you don't go to the sort of working class areas where you would encounter it. I mean, I have been to those areas from time to time. I worked for 3 years in Camden as a community relations officer, dealing with very deprived Black and white communities. And there was some racism, but people were willing to listen. And I remember going to places and kind of giving little talks and trying to educate people about why they shouldn't be racist. So, yes, I think there certainly are elements of racism, but I haven't encountered it. Maybe I've just been fortunate, but there maybe been 1 or 2 episodes where someone's been rude and I've thought, has it got anything to do with the fact that I'm not white?
Okay, so moving on, just to finish our conversation, I'd like to touch briefly on the idea of stolen artifacts in British museums. I say stolen artifacts. Sometimes that word stolen is actually used loosely, but we'll go with it for now. Stolen artifacts and whether or not they should be returned to their countries of origin. So there's an Instagram page with a fairly sizable following called The White Pube. I've had a couple of run-ins with them on Twitter. It's run by 2 extremely woke left-wing activists, and earlier this year, they had billboards put up all over the country with these words on them. Dear museums, give back all stolen objects. That's all it said, these billboards. Dear museums, give back all stolen objects. What are your thoughts on that statement?
Well, it depends how you define theft. I mean, all cultural artifacts originate somewhere, and if they've traveled across the world, they've probably changed hands more than once. Some would have been acquired as war booty, which was perfectly legal. It was not theft. It was the way that armies were paid. Some would have been gifts from princes or other officials of a foreign country to another country. Some would have been bought and then donated to museums. Museums would have bought some of these things on the open market. So where does the definition of theft come? I mean, the only area where I could see it being a useful definition would be if you had a temple in worship, which was still, not something that was 1,000 years ago and ended, but was still in worship. And you had a central idol, as some of them do, and that idol was an antiquity which had a lot of value to it. and some antique thieves came along and stole it, much as they might steal a Rembrandt or a Picasso or something, from a Western art collection. If it was stolen, then obviously there should be police action to trace it and recover it and return it to its rightful owner. But most of the artifacts in museums, Western or for that matter, Indian, because thanks to the British, we have several museums in India which were set up. Indians didn't particularly want to have museums, we didn't collect old things. But the museums in India and the museums here, are full of objects which were excavated, which were discovered, which were conserved from ruins, which belonged to no one. So there was no question of theft. And certainly if you look at, say, African or Indian collections in somewhere like the British Museum, they're tiny compared with the collections that remain in those Indian or African source countries and in the museums which those countries do not even have the space to display them. In India, the museums have much more in their basements than they can positively display.
I've also heard it put forward that that many of the world's antiquities would have been lost forever were it not for restoration in Western museums. Is that correct?
Well, absolutely, because as I say, in India, there was no tradition of treasuring antiquities. If something was old, you threw it away or you used it to make something new. In other words, you used old stones to build new homes. You didn't treasure old statues because they were old. If they were gold or silver, you treasured them. But that was it. You didn't treasure antiquity for the sake of it. So this was very much a Western preoccupation, the idea of collecting and conserving antiquities, which is why it was the British who set up virtually all the museums in countries like India and in most of Africa.
On the Benin bronzes specifically, there's several organizations in Nigeria, including I think maybe the family or the descendants of the family that the Benin bronzes were stolen from, that are actually asking for the Benin bronzes back. For those who aren't aware, the Benin bronzes were taken by British troops from the Kingdom of Benin, which is now Nigeria, in 1897, and they are a collection of sculptures, including plaques and heads and animals and human figures, and they currently reside in museums and private collections all over the world. The largest collection is in the British Museum. There is also a Benin bronze here in Bristol. So Nigeria, or the organizations in Nigeria, have repeatedly asked for them back. And I think worldwide, only one museum, Aberdeen, has agreed to return their Benin bronze. Do you think in this context there's ever an argument that they should be returned when we are able to sort of determine where they came from and perhaps where they should be returned to?
Well, you said at the beginning, stolen. I don't know how one defines that. Yes,
Right.
they were captured in the course of a war, which the British fought against the Benin Kingdom. And in the course of winning that war, they sacked the palace of the King of Benin and took away these bronzes, which I think were the only things of any value. Now, I'm not a great expert on African art. The Benin bronzes are not, in my opinion, great world art. I mean, I don't particularly mind where they are. They're not something that particularly turns me on. If British museums wanted to return them, fine, but I don't think they should be returned because they're stolen. I think they should be wherever people want them to be in terms of the largest footfall, which I think is in museums like the British Museum or the Louvre in Paris, not in some museum tucked away somewhere in Nigeria where they wouldn't be properly conserved, where they don't have the space to display them properly, where they already have their own substantial collections of Benin bronzes, because the majority of Benin bronzes stayed in Benin and Nigeria.
So why do you think there has been such Why do you think there has been such a clamour for the Benin bronzes to be returned? They seem to have made headlines and attracted people's attention more than presumably potentially thousands of other antiquities may have. What's so special about the Benin bronzes that everyone seems to be talking about them?
Because they represent the most visible sort of antiquities from Africa. Africa is not rich in antiquities. It didn't, African indigenous populations didn't value antiquities for the sake of antiquities. They didn't create anything like the art that was created in India or China. So the Benin bronzes are probably regarded as the peak of what African societies were able to produce. And also because they were targeted by someone like David Olusoga, who is half Nigerian, Anglo-Nigerian, and he saw the Benin bronzes as a child at the British Museum, which turned him on to African culture. And he's been campaigning for them to be returned. But, the answer to David Olusoga is if people like him were not able to have seen them at the British Museum, he would not have experienced them as a child. So, I think if people want to return them and the museum wants to return them and their local communities aren't bothered, well, that's fine with me.
So, Zareer, just to end the conversation, I'm going to have to apologize before I read this out to you because it's a lot of nonsense, but I would really like to get your opinion on it. I mentioned earlier the Instagram page which put up the billboard saying, "Dear museums, give back all stolen objects." I would just like to read to you their reason for why they believe this, why they believe that the stolen objects should be returned, and I'd love to get your opinion on that. So they say, the UK is not a post-racial or even multicultural country. The UK is literally where racism was invented. British museums are still in possession of stolen objects whose returns have been requested time and time again by their countries of origin. The Benin bronzes and the Elgin marbles are just two examples of high-profile contestations that museums and the government are willing to take international heat for hanging on to. It can seem like a strange hill to die on, but of course it has a historical precedent. The UK used to have an empire. The stolen objects in British museums are the loot of that empire. Regardless of how many reports our government commissions to try and redirect opinion on this, the reality of the UK as a deeply, insidiously racist country is clear. Museums are our trophy cases.
Well, it's clear that the people who drafted this and campaigning around it needed a target for their assault on the British state, on British nationhood and British sense of its own identity and culture. And the idea of stolen loot from the rest of the world is a very easy kind of target to pick on, and without any kind of knowledge of what these items are, where they come from, how they travel to Britain, to just see them as targets of British plunder and loot. And I think this idea that Britain is somehow uniquely racist, I'd like to hear one bit of evidence from them about how Britain invented racism.
It's quite the claim, isn't it?
Absolutely. I must admit, I haven't heard that particular claim yet about Britain inventing racism, but I think that really says it all. I mean, if that's their starting point, then, there's nothing the British state could do that would satisfy them. Even if objects were returned, they'd say, oh, this is just trying to buy off people when you're still very racist.
100%. Nothing would satisfy them.
No, it's a kind of victimhood, a kind of grievance culture that feeds on itself, and it'll find some object or other to attach itself to.
Do you have any words of hope for the current situation we find ourselves in? Do you think this is a trend which will go out of fashion, or do you think that it's gone deeper than that and it's here to stay?
Well, I don't think it's that powerful. I mean, it's been quite strongly rejected by the government, which is a democratically elected government. I think the vast majority of the British public have very little sympathy for it. I'm not sure that even the majority of Black or Asian people have any sympathy for it. I mean, there are several Black intellectuals and artists who have dissociated themselves from it. So I think it's a Marxist-led front organization, which, like many Marxist-led front organizations, will eventually wither and die, and will move on to something else.
Well, that's extremely optimistic, and I very much hope you're correct. I've had some difficult conversations with friends and people that I know in Bristol who have become extremely wrapped up in this stuff over the last couple of years, and it strikes me as a sort of a religiosity filling the secular void.
But even you know Bristol far better than I do, but I've seen references to the Black Mayor of Bristol taking quite a balanced, nuanced approach to the whole thing. I mean, he was quite happy to see the Colston statue go, but he dissociated himself from the direct action to remove it. So I think he has a middle position, which I think certainly will be the outcome in the end.
I very much hope so. One final question, I can't resist asking it. I was just about to end the conversation, but seeing as we're in this direction, I'll just ask this. Have you heard of and do you believe in the term white privilege?
Well, I've heard it very often.
Yeah.
I've heard male privilege very often too. But with all these sort of labels of who is privileged and who isn't, I think it's a sort of silly, childish kind of playground stuff to basically hang a label on someone because they happen to be a certain color or a certain gender, and to therefore discredit everything they say and say, oh, well, it's just because you're white privileged or because you're male privileged that you say these things. People, need to be treated as individuals. It's nonsense.
I very much agree. Dr. Zareer Masani, it has been an absolute pleasure speaking to you this afternoon. Thank you very much for joining me. Is there any social media channels, website, or anything that you would like to share before we?
Well, I have an account on Twitter, which is at Zareer Masani, and that's about it. No, I don't do any other social media, I'm afraid.
I'll leave a link to your Twitter in the description of this YouTube video, and I'll also reference the books that you've written in case anyone wants to take a look at them.
Okay. All the best. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for talking to me. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.